Part 1, Chapter 3 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 3. Soames prepares to take steps. When Soames entered his sister's little Louis XV drawing-room, with its small balcony, always flowered with hanging geraniums in the summer, and now with pots of Lilium auratum, he was struck by the immutability of human affairs. It looked just the same as on his first visit to the newly married Dartys 21 years ago. He had chosen the furniture himself, and so completely that no subsequent purchase had ever been able to change the room's atmosphere. Yes, he had founded his sister well, and she had wanted it. Indeed, it said a great deal for Winifred that after all this time with Dartie she remained well founded. From the first, Soames had nosed out Dartie's nature from underneath the plausibility, savoir-faire, and good looks which had dazzled Winifred, her mother, and even James, to the extent of permitting the fellow to marry his daughter without bringing anything but shares of no value into the settlement. Winifred, whom he noticed next to the furniture, was sitting at her buhl bureau, with a letter in her hand. She rose and came towards him. Tall as himself, strong in the cheekbones, well-tailored, something in her face disturbed Soames. She crumpled the letter in her hand, but seemed to change her mind, and held it out to him. He was her lawyer as well as her brother. Soames read, on Iseeum Club paper, these words: "You will not get the chance to insult in my own again. I am leaving country to-morrow. It's played out. I'm tired of being insulted by you. You've brought it on yourself. No self-respecting man can stand it. I shall not ask you for anything again. Good-bye. I took the photograph of the two girls. Give them my love. I don't care what your family say. It's all their doing. I'm going to live new life. M.D." This after-dinner note had a splotch on it, not yet quite dry. He looked at Winifred. The splotch had clearly come from her, and he checked the words, "Good riddance." Then it occurred to him that with this letter she was entering that very state which he himself so earnestly desired to quit, the state of a Forsyte who was not divorced. Winifred had turned away, and was taking a long sniff from a little gold-topped bottle. A dull commiseration, together with a vague sense of injury, crept about Soames' heart. He had come to her to talk of his own position and get sympathy, and here she was in the same position, wanting, of course, to talk of it and get sympathy from him. It was always like that. Nobody ever seemed to think that he had troubles and interests of his own. He folded up the letter with the splotch inside, and said: "What's it all about now?" Winifred recited the story of the pearls calmly. "Do you think he's really gone, Soames? You see the state he was in when he wrote that." Soames, who, when he desired a thing, placated Providence by pretending that he did not think it likely to happen, answered: "I shouldn't think so. I might find out at his club." "If George is there," said Winifred, "he would know." "George?" said Soames. "I saw him at his father's funeral." "Then he's sure to be there." Soames, whose good sense applauded his sister's acumen, said grudgingly: "Well, I'll go round. Have you said anything in Park Lane?" "I've told Emily," returned Winifred, who retained that chic way of describing her mother. "Father would have a fit." Indeed, anything untoward was now sedulously kept from James. With another look round at the furniture, as if to gauge his sister's exact position, Soames went out towards Piccadilly. The evening was drawing in, a touch of chill in the October haze. He walked quickly, with his close and concentrated air. He must get through, for he wished to dine in Soho. On hearing from the hall porter at the Iseeum that Mr. Dartie had not been in to-day, he looked at the trusty fellow, and decided only to ask if Mr. George Forsyte was in the club. He was. Soames, who always looked askance at his cousin George, as one inclined to jest at his expense, followed the page boy, slightly reassured by the thought that George had just lost his father. He must have come in for about 30,000, besides what he had under that settlement of Roger's, which had avoided death duty. He found George in a bow window, staring out across a half-eaten plate of muffins. His tall, bulky, black-clothed figure loomed almost threatening, though preserving still the supernatural neatness of the racing man. With a faint grin on his fleshy face, he said, "Hullo, Soames! Have a muffin?" "No, thanks," murmured Soames, and nursing his hat, with the desire to say something suitable and sympathetic, added, "How's your mother?" "Thanks," said George. "So. Haven't seen you for ages. You never go racing. How's the city?" Soames, scenting the approach of a jest, closed up and answered, "I wanted to ask you about Dartie. I hear he's—" "Flitted. Made a bolt to Buenos Aires with the fair Lola. Good for Winifred and the little Darties. He's a treat." Soames nodded. Naturally inimical as these cousins were, Dartie made them kin. "Uncle James'll sleep in his bed now," resumed George. "I suppose he's had a lot off you too." Soames smiled. "Ah, you saw him further," said George amicably. "He's a real rouser. Young Val will want a bit of looking after. I was always sorry for Winifred. She's a plucky woman." Again Soames nodded. "I must be getting back to her," he said. "She just wanted to know for certain. We may have to take steps. I suppose there's no mistake?" "It's quite O.K.," said George. It was he who invented so many of those quaint sayings which have been assigned to other sources. "He was as drunk as a lord last night, but he went off all right this morning. His ship's the Tuscarora." And fishing out a card, he read mockingly: "Mr. Montague Dartie, Poste Restante, Buenos Aires. I should hurry up with the steps if I were you. He fairly fed me up last night." "Yes," said Soames, "but it's not always easy." Then, conscious from George's eyes that he had roused reminiscence of his own affair, he got up and held out his hand. George rose too. "Remember me to Winifred. You'll enter her for the divorce stakes straight off, if you ask me." Soames took a sidelong look back at him from the doorway. George had seated himself again and was staring before him. He looked big and lonely in those black clothes. Soames had never known him so subdued. "I suppose he feels it in a way," he thought. "They must have about 50,000 each, all told. They ought to keep the estate together. If there's a war, house property will go down. Uncle Roger was a good judge, though." And the face of Annette rose before him in the darkening street, her brown hair and her blue eyes with those dark lashes, her fresh lips and cheeks, dewy and blooming in spite of London, her perfect French figure. Take steps, he thought. Re-entering Winifred's house, he encountered Val, and they went in together. An idea had occurred to Soames. His cousin Jolyon was Irene's trustee. The first step would be to go down and see him at Robin Hill. Robin Hill! The very odd feeling those words brought back. Robin Hill! The house Bosinney had built for him and Irene, the house they had never lived in, the fatal house. And Jolyon lived there now. And suddenly he thought, they say he's got a boy at Oxford. Why not take young Val down and introduce them? It's an excuse. Less bald, very much less bald. So as they went upstairs, he said to Val: "You've got a cousin at Oxford. You've never met him. I should like to take you down with me tomorrow to where he lives and introduce you. You'll find it useful." Val, receiving the idea with but moderate transports, Soames clinched it. "I'll call for you after lunch. It's in the country, not far. You'll enjoy it." On the threshold of the drawing-room he recalled with an effort that the steps he contemplated concerned Winifred at the moment, not himself. Winifred was still sitting at her buhl bureau. "It's quite true," he said. "He's gone to Buenos Aires. Started this morning. We'd better have him shadowed when he lands. I'll cable at once, otherwise we may have a lot of expense. The sooner these things are done, the better. I'm always regretting that I didn't—" He stopped and looked sidelong at the silent Winifred. "By the way," he went on, "can you prove cruelty?" Winifred said in a dull voice: "I don't know. What is cruelty?" "Well, has he struck you or anything?" Winifred shook herself, and her jaw grew square. "He twisted my arm. Or would pointing a pistol count? Or being too drunk to undress himself? Or... No, I can't bring in the children." "No," said Soames, "no. I wonder. Of course there's legal separation. We can get that. But separation... "What does it mean?" asked Winifred desolately. "That he can't touch you, or you him. You're both of you married and unmarried." And again he grunted. What was it, in fact, but his own accursed position legalised? No, he would not put her into that. "It must be divorce," he said decisively. "Failing cruelty, there's desertion. There's a way of shortening the 2 years now. We get the court to give us restitution of conjugal rights. Then, if he doesn't obey, we can bring a suit for divorce in 6 months' time. Of course you don't want him back, but they won't know that. Still, there's the risk that he might come. I'd rather try cruelty." Winifred shook her head. "It's so beastly." "Well," Soames murmured, "perhaps there isn't much risk so long as he's infatuated and got money. Don't say anything to anybody, and don't pay any of his debts." Winifred sighed. In spite of all she had been through, the sense of loss was heavy on her. And this idea of not paying his debts any more brought it home to her as nothing else yet had. Some richness seemed to have gone out of life. Without her husband, without her pearls, without that intimate sense that she made a brave show above the domestic whirlpool, she would now have to face the world. She felt bereaved indeed. And into the chilly kiss he placed on her forehead, Soames put more than his usual warmth. "I have to go down to Robin Hill to morrow," he said, "to see young Jolyon on business. He's got a boy at Oxford. I'd like to take Val with me and introduce him. Come down to the Shelter for the week end and bring the children. Oh, by the way, no, that won't do. I've got some other people coming." So saying, he left her, and turned towards Soho. End of Part 1, Chapter 3. Part 1, Chapter 4 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2. In Chancery by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 4. Soho. Of all quarters in the queer adventurous amalgam called London, Soho is perhaps least suited to the Forsyte spirit. "So ho, my wild one," George would have said if he could have seen his cousin going there. Untidy, full of Greeks, Ishmaelites, cats, Italians, tomatoes, restaurants, organs, coloured stuffs, queer names, people looking out of upper windows. It dwells remote from the British body politic, yet it has haphazard proprietary instincts of its own, and a certain possessive prosperity which keeps its rents up when those of other quarters go down. For long years Soames's acquaintanceship with Soho had been confined to its western bastion, Wardour Street. Many bargains had he picked up there. Even during those 7 years at Brighton, after Bosinney's death and Irene's flight, he had bought treasures there sometimes, though he had no place to put them. For when the conviction that his wife had gone for good at last became firm within him, he had caused a board to be put up in Montpellier Square. For sale, the lease of this desirable residence. Inquire of Messrs. Lesson and Tukes, Court Street, Belgravia. It had sold within a week, that desirable residence, in the shadow of whose perfection a man and a woman had eaten their hearts out. Of a misty January evening, just before the board was taken down, Soames had gone there once more, and stood against the square railings, looking at its unlighted windows, chewing the cud of possessive memories which had turned so bitter in his mouth. Why had she never loved him? Why? She had been given all she wanted, and in return had given him, for 3 long years, all he had wanted, except, indeed, her heart. He had uttered a little involuntary groan, and a passing policeman had glanced suspiciously at him, who no longer possessed the right to enter that green door with the carved brass knocker beneath the board "For Sale." A choking sensation had attacked his throat, and he had hurried away into the mist. That evening he had gone to Brighton to live. Approaching Malta Street, Soho, and the Restaurant Bretagne, where Annette would be drooping her pretty shoulders over her accounts, Soames thought with wonder of those 7 years at Brighton. How had he managed to go on so long in that town devoid of the scent of sweet peas, where he had not even space to put his treasures? True, those had been years with no time at all for looking at them, years of almost passionate money-making, during which Forsyte, Bustard, and Forsyte had become solicitors to more limited companies than they could properly attend to. Up to the city of a morning in a Pullman car, down from the city of an evening in a Pullman car. Law papers again after dinner, then the sleep of the tired, and up again next morning. Saturday to Monday was spent at his club in town. Curious reversal of customary procedure, based on the deep and careful instinct that while working so hard he needed sea air to and from the station twice a day, and while resting must indulge his domestic affections. The Sunday visit to his family in Park Lane, to Timothy's, and to Green Street, the occasional visits elsewhere, had seemed to him as necessary to health as the sea air on weekdays. Even since his migration to Mapledurham he had maintained those habits until he had known Annette. Whether Annette had produced the revolution in his outlook, or that outlook had produced Annette, he knew no more than we know where a circle begins. It was intricate and deeply involved with the growing consciousness that property without anyone to leave it to is the negation of true Forsyteism. To have an heir, some continuance of self, who would begin where he left off, ensure, in fact, that he would not leave off, had quite obsessed him for the last year and more. After buying a bit of Wedgwood one evening in April, he had dropped into Malta Street to look at a house of his father's, which had been turned into a restaurant, a risky proceeding, and one not quite in accordance with the terms of the lease. He had stared for a little at the outside, painted a good cream colour, with 2 peacock blue tubs containing little bay trees in a recessed doorway, and at the words Restaurant Bretagne above them in gold letters. Rather favourably impressed. Entering, he had noticed that several people were already seated at little round green tables with little pots of fresh flowers on them, and Brittany-ware plates, and had asked of a trim waitress to see the proprietor. They had shown him into a back room, where a girl was sitting at a simple bureau covered with papers, and a small round table was laid for 2. The impression of cleanliness, order, and good taste was confirmed when the girl got up, saying, "You wish to see Maman, monsieur?" in a broken accent. "Yes," Soames had answered. "I represent your landlord. In fact, I'm his son. Won't you sit down, sir, please? Tell Maman to come to this gentleman." He was pleased that the girl seemed impressed, because it showed business instinct, and suddenly he noticed that she was remarkably pretty, so remarkably pretty that his eyes found a difficulty in leaving her face. When she moved to put a chair for him, she swayed in a curious subtle way, as if she had been put together by someone with a special secret skill, and her face and neck, which was a little bared, looked as fresh as if they had been sprayed with dew. Probably at this moment Soames decided that the lease had not been violated, though to himself and his father he based the decision on the efficiency of those illicit adaptations in the building, on the signs of prosperity and the obvious business capacity of Madame Lamotte. He did not, however, neglect to leave certain matters to future consideration, which had necessitated further visits, so that the little back room had become quite accustomed to his spare, not unsolid but unobtrusive figure, and his pale, chinny face, with clipped moustache and dark hair not yet grizzling at the sides. "Monsieur très distingué," Madame Lamotte found him, and presently "très amical, très gentil," watching his eyes upon her daughter. She was one of those generously built, fine-faced, dark-haired Frenchwomen whose every action and tone of voice inspire perfect confidence in the thoroughness of their domestic tastes, their knowledge of cooking, and the careful increase of their bank balances. After those visits to the Restaurant Bretagne began, other visits ceased, without indeed any definite decision, for Soames, like all Forsytes, and the great majority of their countrymen, was a born empiricist. But it was this change in his mode of life which gradually made him so definitely conscious that he desired to alter his condition from that of the unmarried married man to that of the married man remarried. Turning into Malta Street on this evening of early October 1899, he bought a paper to see if there were any after developments of the Dreyfus case, a question which he always found useful in making closer acquaintanceship with Madame Lamotte and her daughter, who were Catholic and anti-Dreyfusard. Scanning those columns, Soames found nothing French, but noticed a general fall on the Stock Exchange, and an ominous leader about the Transvaal. He entered, thinking, "War's a certainty. I shall sell my consols." Not that he had many personally, the rate of interest was too wretched, but he should advise his companies. Consols would assuredly go down. A look, as he passed the doorways of the restaurant, assured him that business was good as ever, and this, which in April would have pleased him, now gave him a certain uneasiness. If the steps which he had to take ended in his marrying Annette, he would rather see her mother safely back in France, a move to which the prosperity of the Restaurant Bretagne might become an obstacle. He would have to buy them out, of course, for French people only came to England to make money, and it would mean a higher price. And then that peculiar sweet sensation at the back of his throat, and a slight thumping about the heart, which he always experienced at the door of the little room, prevented his thinking how much it would cost. Going in, he was conscious of an abundant black skirt vanishing through the door into the restaurant, and of Annette with her hands up to her hair. It was the attitude in which of all others he admired her, so beautifully straight and rounded and supple. And he said, "I just came in to talk to your mother about pulling down that partition. No, don't call her." "Monsieur will have supper with us? It will be ready in 10 minutes." Soames, who still held her hand, was overcome by an impulse which surprised him. "You look so pretty tonight," he said, "so very pretty. Do you know how pretty you look, Annette?" Annette withdrew her hand and blushed. "Monsieur is very good." "Not a bit good," said Soames, and sat down gloomily. Annette made a little expressive gesture with her hands. A smile was crinkling her red lips, untouched by salve. And, looking at those lips, Soames said: "Are you happy over here, or do you want to go back to France?" "Oh, I like London. Paris, of course, but London is better than Orléans, and the English countryside is so beautiful. I have been to Richmond last Sunday." Soames went through a moment of calculating struggle. Mapledurham! Dared he? After all, dared he go as far as that, and show her what there was to look forward to? Still, down there one could say things; in this room it was impossible. "I want you and your mother," he said suddenly, "to come for the afternoon next Sunday. My house is on the river. It's not too late in this weather, and I can show you some good pictures. What do you say?" Annette clasped her hands. "It will be lovely. The river is so beautiful." "That's understood, then. I'll ask Madame." He need say no more to her this evening and risk giving himself away. But had he not already said too much? Did one ask restaurant proprietors with pretty daughters down to one's country house without design? Madame Lamotte would see, if Annette didn't. Well, there was not much that Madame did not see. Besides, this was the second time he had stayed to supper with them. He owed them hospitality. Walking home towards Park Lane, for he was staying at his father's, with the impression of Annette's soft, clever hand within his own, his thoughts were pleasant, slightly sensual, rather puzzled. Take steps. What steps? How? Dirty linen washed in public? Pah! With his reputation for sagacity, for far-sightedness, and the clever extrication of others, he who stood for proprietary interests to become the plaything of that law of which he was a pillar! There was something revolting in the thought. Winifred's affair was bad enough. To have a double dose of publicity in the family! Would not a liaison be better than that? A liaison, and a son he could adopt? But dark, solid, watchful, Madame Lamotte blocked the avenue of that vision. No, that would not work. It was not as if Annette could have a real passion for him. One could not expect that at his age. If her mother wished, if the worldly advantage were manifestly great, perhaps. If not, refusal would be certain. Besides, he thought, I'm not a villain. I don't want to hurt her, and I don't want anything underhand. But I do want her, and I want a son. There's nothing for it but divorce. Somehow, anyhow, divorce. Under the shadow of the plane trees, in the lamplight, he passed slowly along the railings of the Green Park. Mist clung there among the bluish tree shapes, beyond range of the lamps. How many hundred times had he walked past those trees from his father's house in Park Lane, when he was quite a young man, or from his own house in Montpellier Square in those 4 years of married life! And tonight, making up his mind to free himself, if he could, of that long, useless marriage tie, he took a fancy to walk on, in at Hyde Park Corner, out at Knightsbridge Gate, just as he used to when going home to Irene in the old days. What could she be like now? How had she passed the years since he last saw her? 12 years in all. 7 already since Uncle Jolyon left her that money. Was she still beautiful? Would he know her if he saw her? I've not changed much, he thought. I expect she has. She made me suffer. He remembered suddenly one night, the first on which he went out to dinner alone, an old Malburian dinner, the first year of their marriage. With what eagerness he had hurried back, and entering softly as a cat, had heard her playing. Opening the drawing-room door noiselessly, he had stood watching the expression on her face, different from any he knew, so much more open, so confiding, as though to her music she was giving a heart he had never seen. And he remembered how she stopped and looked round, how her face changed back to that which he did know, and what an icy shiver had gone through him, for all that the next moment he was fondling her shoulders. Yes, she had made him suffer. Divorce? It seemed ridiculous after all these years of utter separation. But it would have to be. No other way. The question, he thought with sudden realism, is, which of us? She or me? She deserted me. She ought to pay for it. There'll be someone, I suppose. Involuntarily he uttered a little snarling sound, and turning made his way back to Park Lane. End of Part 1, Chapter 4. Part 1, Chapter 5 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2. In Chancery by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 5. James sees visions. The butler himself opened the door, and closing it softly, detained Soames on the inner mat. "The master's poorly, sir," he murmured. "He wouldn't go to bed till you came in. He's still in the dining room." Soames responded in the hushed tone to which the house was now accustomed. "What's the matter with him, Warmson?" "Nervous, sir, I think. It might be the funeral. Might be Mrs. Dartie's coming round this afternoon. I think he overheard something. I've took him a negus. The mistress has just gone up." Soames hung his hat on a mahogany stag's horn. "All right, Warmson, you can go to bed. I'll take him up myself." And he passed into the dining room. James was sitting before the fire, in a big arm-chair, with a camel hair shawl, very light and warm, over his frock-coated shoulders, on to which his long white whiskers drooped. His white hair, still fairly thick, glistened in the lamplight. A little moisture from his fixed, light grey eyes stained the cheeks, still quite well coloured, and the long, deep furrows running to the corners of the clean-shaven lips, which moved as if mumbling thoughts. His long legs, thin as a crow's, in shepherd's plaid trousers, were bent at less than a right angle, and on one knee a spindly hand moved continually, with fingers wide apart and glistening tapered nails. Beside him, on a low stool, stood a half-finished glass of negus, bedewed with beads of heat. There he had been sitting, with intervals for meals, all day. At 88 he was still organically sound, but suffering terribly from the thought that no one ever told him anything. It is indeed doubtful how he had become aware that Roger was being buried that day, for Emily had kept it from him. She was always keeping things from him. Emily was only 70. James had a grudge against his wife's youth. He felt sometimes that he would never have married her if he had known that she would have so many years before her, when he had so few. It was not natural. She would live 15 or 20 years after he was gone, and might spend a lot of money. And she'd always had extravagant tastes. For all he knew, she might want to buy one of these motor cars. Cicely and Rachel and Imogen and all the young people, they all rode these bicycles now, and went off goodness knows where. And now Roger was gone. He didn't know, couldn't tell. The family was breaking up. Soames would know how much his uncle had left. Curiously, he thought of Roger as Soames's uncle, not as his own brother. Soames! It was more and more the one solid spot in a vanishing world. Soames was careful. He was a warm man, but he had no one to leave his money to. There it was, he didn't know. And there was that fellow Chamberlain. For James's political principles had been fixed between 70 and 85, when that rascally Radical had been the chief thorn in the side of property, and he distrusted him to this day, in spite of his conversion. He would get the country into a mess, and make money go down before he had done with it. A stormy petrel of a chap. Where was Soames? He had gone to the funeral, of course, which they had tried to keep from him. He knew that perfectly well. He had seen his son's trousers. Roger in his coffin. He remembered how, when they came up from school together from the West, on the box seat of the old slow fire in 1824, Roger had got into the boot and gone to sleep. James uttered a thin cackle. A funny fellow, Roger, an original. He didn't know. Younger than himself, and in his coffin. The family was breaking up. There was Val going to university. He never came to see him now. He would cost a pretty penny up there. It was an extravagant age. And all the pretty pennies that his 4 grandchildren would cost him danced before James's eyes. He did not grudge them the money, but he grudged terribly the risk which the spending of that money might bring on them. He grudged the diminution of security. And now that Cicely had married, she might be having children too. He didn't know, couldn't tell. Nobody thought of anything but spending money in these days, and racing about, and having what they called a good time. A motor car went past the window. Ugly, great, lumbering thing, making all that racket. But there it was, the country rattling to the dogs. People in such a hurry that they couldn't even care for style. A neat turnout like his barouche and bays was worth all these new-fangled things. And consols at 116. There must be a lot of money in the country. And now there was this old Kruger. They had tried to keep old Kruger from him, but he knew better. There would be a pretty kettle of fish out there. He had known how it would be when that fellow Gladstone, dead now, thank God, made such a mess of it after that dreadful business at Majuba. He shouldn't wonder if the Empire split up and went to pot. And this vision of the Empire going to pot filled a full quarter of an hour with qualms of the most serious character. He had eaten a poor lunch because of them. But it was after lunch that the real disaster to his nerves occurred. He had been dozing when he became aware of voices, low voices. Ah, they never told him anything. Winifred's and her mother's. Monty. That fellow Dartie, always that fellow Dartie. The voices had receded, and James had been left alone with his ears standing up like a hare's, and fear creeping about his inwards. Why did they leave him alone? Why didn't they come and tell him? And an awful thought, which through long years had haunted him, concreted again swiftly in his brain. Dartie had gone bankrupt, fraudulently bankrupt, and to save Winifred and the children, he, James, would have to pay. Could Soames turn him into a limited company? No, he couldn't. There it was. With every minute before Emily came back, the spectre fiercened. Why, it might be forgery. With eyes fixed on the doubted Turner in the centre of the wall, James suffered tortures. He saw Dartie in the dock, his grandchildren in the gutter, and himself in bed. He saw the doubted Turner being sold at Jobson's, and all the majestic edifice of property in rags. He saw in fancy Winifred, unfashionably dressed, and heard in fancy Emily's voice saying, "Now don't fuss, James." She was always saying, "Don't fuss." She had no nerves. He ought never to have married a woman 18 years younger than himself. Then Emily's real voice said, "Have you had a nice nap, James?" Nap? He was in torment, and she asked him that. "What's this about Dartie?" he said, and his eyes glared at her. Emily's self-possession never deserted her. "What have you been hearing?" she asked blandly. "What's this about Dartie?" repeated James. "He's gone bankrupt." "Fiddle!" James made a great effort, and rose to the full height of his stork-like figure. "You never tell me anything," he said. "He's gone bankrupt." The destruction of that fixed idea seemed to Emily all that mattered at the moment. "He has not," she answered firmly. "He's gone to Buenos Aires." If she had said, "He's gone to Mars," she could not have dealt James a more stunning blow. His imagination, invested entirely in British securities, could as little grasp one place as the other. "What's he gone there for?" he said. "He's got no money. What did he take?" Agitated within by Winifred's news, and goaded by the constant reiteration of this jeremiad, Emily said calmly, "He took Winifred's pearls and a dancer." "What?" said James, and sat down. His sudden collapse alarmed her, and smoothing his forehead, she said, "Now don't fuss, James." A dusky red had spread over James's cheeks and forehead. "I paid for them," he said tremblingly. "He's a thief. I knew how it would be. He'll be the death of me. He—" Words failed him, and he sat quite still. Emily, who thought she knew him so well, was alarmed, and went towards the sideboard where she kept some sal volatile. She could not see the tenacious Forsyte spirit working in that thin, tremulous shape against the extravagance of the emotion called up by this outrage on Forsyte principles. The Forsyte spirit deep in there saying, "You mustn't get into a fantod, it never do. You won't digest your lunch, you'll have a fit." All unseen by her, it was doing better work in James than sal volatile. "Drink this," she said. James waved it aside. "What was Winifred about?" he said. "To let him take her pearls?" Emily perceived the crisis past. "She can have mine," she said comfortably. "I never wear them. She'd better get a divorce." "There you go," said James. "Divorce? We've never had a divorce in the family. Where's Soames?" "He'll be in directly." "No, he won't," said James, almost fiercely. "He's at the funeral. You think I know nothing." "Well," said Emily with calm, "you shouldn't get into such fusses when we tell you things." And plumping up his cushions, and putting the sal volatile beside him, she left the room. But James sat there seeing visions of Winifred in the divorce court, and the family name in the papers, of the earth falling on Roger's coffin, of Val taking after his father, of the pearls he had paid for and would never see again, of money back at 4%, and the country going to the dogs. And as the afternoon wore into evening, and tea time passed, and dinner time, those visions became more and more mixed and menacing, of being told nothing, till he had nothing left of all his wealth, and they told him nothing of it. Where was Soames? Why didn't he come in? His hand grasped the glass of negus. He raised it to drink, and saw his son standing there looking at him. A little sigh of relief escaped his lips, and putting the glass down, he said: "There you are. Dartie's gone to Buenos Aires." Soames nodded. "That's all right," he said. "Good riddance." A wave of assuagement passed over James's brain. Soames knew. Soames was the only one of them all who had sense. Why couldn't he come and live at home? He had no son of his own. And he said plaintively: "At my age I get nervous. I wish you were more at home, my boy." Again Soames nodded. The mask of his countenance betrayed no understanding, but he went closer, and as if by accident touched his father's shoulder. "They sent their love to you at Timothy's," he said. "It went off all right. I've been to see Winifred. I'm going to take steps." And he thought: "Yes, and you mustn't hear of them." James looked up. His long white whiskers quivered. His thin throat between the points of his collar looked very grisly and naked. "I've been very poorly all day," he said. "They never tell me anything." Soames's heart twitched. "Well, it's all right. There's nothing to worry about. Will you come up now?" And he put his hand under his father's arm. James obediently and tremulously raised himself, and together they went slowly across the room, which had a rich look in the firelight, and out to the stairs. Very slowly they ascended. "Good night, my boy," said James at his bedroom door. "Good night, father," answered Soames. His hand stroked down the sleeve beneath the shawl. It seemed to have almost nothing in it, so thin was the arm. And turning away from the light in the opening doorway, he went up the extra flight to his own bedroom. "I want a son," he thought, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I want a son." End of Part 1, Chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 6. No longer Young Jolyon at home. Trees take little account of time, and the old oak on the upper lawn at Robin Hill looked no day older than when Bosinney sprawled under it and said to Soames: "Forsyte, I found the very place for your house." Since then Swithin had dreamed, and old Jolyon died beneath its branches. And now, close to the swing, no longer Young Jolyon often painted there. Of all spots in the world it was perhaps the most sacred to him, for he had loved his father. Contemplating its great girth, crinkled and a little mossed but not yet hollow, he would speculate on the passage of time. That tree had seen, perhaps, all real English history. It dated, he shouldn't wonder, from the days of Elizabeth at least. His own 50 years were as nothing to its wood. When the house behind it, which he now owned, was 300 years of age instead of 12, that tree might still be standing there, vast and hollow, for who would commit such sacrilege as to cut it down? A Forsyte might perhaps still be living in that house, to guard it jealously, and Jolyon would wonder what the house would look like coated with such age. Wistaria was already about its walls; the new look had gone. Would it hold its own and keep the dignity Bosinney had bestowed on it, or would the giant London have lapped it round and made it into an asylum in the midst of a jerry-built wilderness? Often, within and without of it, he was persuaded that Bosinney had been moved by the spirit when he built. He had put his heart into that house indeed. It might even become one of the "Homes of England," a rare achievement for a house in these degenerate days of building. And the aesthetic spirit, moving hand in hand with his Forsyte sense of possessive continuity, dwelt with pride and pleasure on his ownership thereof. There was a smack of reverence and ancestor worship, if only for one ancestor, in his desire to hand this house down to his son and his son's son. His father had loved the house, had loved the view, the grounds, that tree. His last years had been happy there, and no one had lived there before him. These last 11 years at Robin Hill had formed in Jolyon's life as a painter the important period of success. He was now in the very van of water-colour art, hanging on the line everywhere. His drawings fetched high prices. Specializing in that one medium with the tenacity of his breed, he had "arrived"; rather late, but not too late for a member of the family which made a point of living for ever. His art had really deepened and improved. In conformity with his position he had grown a short fair beard, which was just beginning to grizzle, and hid his Forsyte chin. His brown face had lost the warped expression of his ostracised period. He looked, if anything, younger. The loss of his wife in 1894 had been one of those domestic tragedies which turn out in the end for the good of all. He had, indeed, loved her to the last, for his was an affectionate spirit, but she had become increasingly difficult. Jealous of her stepdaughter June, jealous even of her own little daughter Holly, and making ceaseless plaint that he could not love her, ill as she was, and "useless to everyone and better dead." He had mourned her sincerely, but his face had looked younger since she died. If she could only have believed that she made him happy, how much happier would the 20 years of their companionship have been! June had never really got on well with her who had reprehensibly taken her own mother's place, and ever since old Jolyon died she had been established in a sort of studio in London. But she had come back to Robin Hill on her stepmother's death, and gathered the reins there into her small decided hands. Jolly was then at Harrow; Holly still learning from Mademoiselle Beauce. There had been nothing to keep Jolyon at home, and he had removed his grief and his paint-box abroad. There he had wandered for the most part in Brittany, and at last had fetched up in Paris. He had stayed there several months, and come back with the younger face and the short fair beard. Essentially a man who merely lodged in any house, it had suited him perfectly that June should reign at Robin Hill, so that he was free to go off with his easel where and when he liked. She was inclined, it is true, to regard the house rather as an asylum for her protégés, but his own outcast days had filled Jolyon for ever with sympathy towards an outcast, and June's lame ducks about the place did not annoy him. By all means let her have them down, and feed them up; and though his slightly cynical humour perceived that they ministered to his daughter's love of domination as well as moved her warm heart, he never ceased to admire her for having so many ducks. He fell, indeed, year by year into a more and more detached and brotherly attitude towards his own son and daughters, treating them with a sort of whimsical equality. When he went down to Harrow to see Jolly, he never quite knew which of them was the elder, and would sit eating cherries with him out of one paper bag, with an affectionate and ironical smile twisting up an eyebrow and curling his lips a little. And he was always careful to have money in his pocket and to be modish in his dress, so that his son need not blush for him. They were perfect friends, but never seemed to have occasion for verbal confidences, both having the competitive self-consciousness of Forsytes. They knew they would stand by each other in scrapes, but there was no need to talk about it. Jolyon had a striking horror, partly original sin, but partly the result of his early immorality, of the moral attitude. The most he could ever have said to his son would have been, "Look here, old man, don't forget you're a gentleman," and then have wondered whimsically whether that was not a snobbish sentiment. The great cricket match was perhaps the most searching and awkward time they annually went through together, for Jolyon had been at Eton. They would be particularly careful during that match, continually saying, "Hooray! Oh, hard luck, old man!" or "Hooray! Oh, bad luck, Dad!" to each other, when some disaster at which their hearts bounded happened to the opposing school. and Jolyon would wear a grey top hat instead of his usual soft one, to save his son's feelings, for a black top hat he could not stomach. When Jolly went up to Oxford, Jolyon went with him, amused, humble, and a little anxious not to discredit his boy amongst all these youths who seemed so much more assured and old than himself. He often thought, "Glad I'm a painter," for he had long dropped underwriting at Lloyd's. It's so innocuous; you can't look down on a painter, you can't take him seriously enough. For Jolly, who had a sort of natural lordliness, had passed at once into a very small set, who secretly amused his father. The boy had fair hair which curled a little, and his grandfather's deep-set iron grey eyes. He was well built and very upright, and always pleased Jolyon's aesthetic sense, so that he was a tiny bit afraid of him, as artists ever are of those of their own sex whom they admire physically. On that occasion, however, he actually did screw up his courage to give his son advice, and this was it. "Look here, old man, you're bound to get into debt. Mind you come to me at once. Of course I'll always pay them. But you might remember that one respects oneself more afterwards if one pays one's own way. And don't ever borrow except from me, will you?" And Jolly had said, "All right, Dad, I won't." And he never had. "And there's just one other thing. I don't know much about morality and that, but there is this. It's always worth while before you do anything to consider whether it's going to hurt another person more than is absolutely necessary." Jolly had looked thoughtful and nodded, and presently had squeezed his father's hand. And Jolyon had thought, "I wonder if I had the right to say that." He always had a sort of dread of losing the dumb confidence they had in each other, remembering how for long years he had lost his own father's, so that there had been nothing between them but love at a great distance. He underestimated, no doubt, the change in the spirit of the age since he himself went up to Cambridge in '65, and perhaps he underestimated, too, his boy's power of understanding that he was tolerant to the very bone. It was that tolerance of his, and possibly his scepticism, which ever made his relations towards June so queerly defensive. She was such a decided mortal, knew her own mind so terribly well, wanted things so inexorably until she got them, and then indeed often dropped them like a hot potato. Her mother had been like that, whence had come all those tears. Not that his incompatibility with his daughter was anything like what it had been with the first Mrs. Young Jolyon. One could be amused where a daughter was concerned; in a wife's case one could not be amused. To see June set her heart and jaw on a thing until she got it was all right, because it was never anything which interfered fundamentally with Jolyon's liberty. The one thing on which his jaw was absolutely rigid, a considerable jaw under that short grizzling beard. Nor was there ever any necessity for real heart-to-heart encounters. One could break away into irony, as indeed he often had to. But the real trouble with June was that she had never appealed to his aesthetic sense, though she might well have, with her red gold hair and her Viking-coloured eyes, and that touch of the berserker in her spirit. It was very different with Holly, soft and quiet, shy and affectionate, with a playful imp in her somewhere. He watched this younger daughter of his through the duckling stage with extraordinary interest. Would she come out a swan? With her sallow oval face and her grey wistful eyes and those long dark lashes, she might or she might not. Only this last year had he been able to guess. Yes, she would be a swan, rather a dark one, always a shy one, but an authentic swan. She was 18 now, and Mademoiselle Beauce was gone. The excellent lady had removed, after 11 years haunted by her continuous reminiscences of the well-bred little Taylors, to another family whose bosom would now be agitated by her reminiscences of the well-bred little Forsytes. She had taught Holly to speak French like herself. Portraiture was not Jolyon's forte, but he had already drawn his younger daughter 3 times, and was drawing her a 4th on the afternoon of October 4th, 1899, when a card was brought to him which caused his eyebrows to go up. Mr. Soames Forsyte, The Shelter, Connoisseurs Club, Maple Durham, St. James's. But here the Forsyte Saga must digress again. To return from a long travel in Spain, to a darkened house, to a little daughter bewildered with tears, to the sight of a loved father lying peaceful in his last sleep, had never been, was never likely to be, forgotten by so impressionable and warm-hearted a man as Jolyon. A sense as of mystery, too, clung to that sad day, and about the end of one whose life had been so well ordered, balanced, and above board. It seemed incredible that his father could thus have vanished without, as it were, announcing his intention, without last words to his son, and due farewells. and those incoherent allusions of little Holly to "the lady in grey," of Mademoiselle Beauce to a Madame Errant, as it sounded, involved all things in a mist, lifted a little when he read his father's will and the codicil thereto. It had been his duty as executor of that will and codicil to inform Irene, wife of his cousin Soames, of her life interest in £15,000. He had called on her to explain that the existing investment in India stock, earmarked to meet the charge, would produce for her the interesting net sum of £430 odd a year, clear of income tax. This was but the third time he had seen his cousin Soames's wife, if indeed she was still his wife, of which he was not quite sure. He remembered having seen her sitting in the Botanical Gardens waiting for Bosinney, a passive, fascinating figure, reminding him of Titian's Heavenly Love, and again, when charged by his father, he had gone to Montpellier Square on the afternoon when Bosinney's death was known. He still recalled vividly her sudden appearance in the drawing-room doorway on that occasion, her beautiful face, passing from wild eagerness of hope to stony despair, remembered the compassion he had felt, Soames's snarling smile, his words, "We are not at home," and the slam of the front door. This third time he saw a face and form more beautiful, freed from that warp of wild hope and despair. Looking at her he thought, "Yes, you are just what the Dad would have admired." And the strange story of his father's Indian summer became slowly clear to him. She spoke of old Jolyon with reverence and tears in her eyes. "He was so wonderfully kind to me, I don't know why. He looked so beautiful and peaceful sitting in that chair under the tree. It was I who first came on him sitting there, you know. Such a lovely day. I don't think an end could have been happier. We should all like to go out like that." Quite right, he had thought. We should all like to go out in full summer with beauty stepping towards us across a lawn. And looking round the little, almost empty drawing-room, he had asked her what she was going to do now. "I am going to live again a little, Cousin Jolyon. It's wonderful to have money of one's own. I've never had any. I shall keep this flat, I think. I'm used to it. But I shall be able to go to Italy." "Exactly," Jolyon had murmured, looking at her faintly smiling lips, and he had gone away thinking, "A fascinating woman. What a waste. I'm glad the Dad left her that money." He had not seen her again, but every quarter he had signed her cheque, forwarding it to her bank, with a note to the Chelsea flat to say that he had done so, and always he had received a note in acknowledgment, generally from the flat, but sometimes from Italy, so that her personality had become embodied in slightly scented grey paper and upright fine handwriting, and the words, "Dear Cousin Jolyon." Man of property that he now was, the slender cheque he signed often gave rise to the thought, "Well, I suppose she just manages," sliding into a vague wonder how she was faring otherwise in a world of men not wont to let beauty go unpossessed. At first Holly had spoken of her sometimes, but ladies in grey soon fade from children's memories, and the tightening of June's lips in those first weeks after her grandfather's death whenever her former friend's name was mentioned had discouraged allusion. Only once, indeed, had June spoken definitely. "I've forgiven her. I'm frightfully glad she's independent now." On receiving Soames's card, Jolyon said to the maid, for he could not abide butlers, "Show him into the study, please, and say I'll be there in a minute." And then he looked at Holly and asked, "Do you remember the lady in grey who used to give you music lessons?" "Oh yes, why, has she come?" Jolyon shook his head, and changing his holland blouse for a coat, was silent, perceiving suddenly that such history was not for those young ears. His face, in fact, became whimsical perplexity incarnate while he journeyed towards the study. Standing by the French window, looking out across the terrace at the oak tree, were two figures, middle-aged and young, and he thought, "Who's that boy? Surely they never had a child." The elder figure turned. The meeting of those two Forsytes of the second generation, so much more sophisticated than the first, and the house built for the one and owned and occupied by the other, was marked by subtle defensiveness beneath distinct attempt at cordiality. "Has he come about his wife?" Jolyon was thinking, and Soames, "How shall I begin?" while Val, brought to break the ice, stood negligently scrutinising this "bearded pard" from under his thick dark eyelashes. "This is Val Dartie," said Soames, "my sister's son. He's just going up to Oxford. I thought I'd like him to know your boy." "Ah, I'm sorry, Jolly's away. What college?" "B.N.C.," replied Val. "Jolly's at the house, but he'll be delighted to look you up." "Thanks awfully. "Holly's in. If you could put up with a female relation, she'd show you around. You'll find her in the hall if you go through the curtains. I was just painting her." With another "Thanks awfully," Val vanished, leaving the two cousins with the ice unbroken. "I see you've some drawings at the water colours," said Soames. Jolyon winced. He had been out of touch with the Forsyte family at large for 26 years, but they were connected in his mind with Frith's Derby Day and Landseer prints. He had heard from June that Soames was a connoisseur, which made it worse. He had become aware, too, of a curious sensation of repugnance. "I haven't seen you for a long time," he said. "No," answered Soames between close lips, "not since... As a matter of fact, it's about that I've come. You're her trustee, I'm told." Jolyon nodded. 12 years is a long time," said Soames rapidly. I'm tired of it." Jolyon found no more appropriate answer than, "Won't you smoke?" "No, thanks." Jolyon himself lit a cigarette. "I wish to be free," said Soames abruptly. "I don't see her," murmured Jolyon through the fume of his cigarette. "But you know where she lives, I suppose?" Jolyon nodded. He did not mean to give her address without permission. Soames seemed to divine his thought. "I don't want her address," he said. "I know it." "What exactly do you want?" "She deserted me. I want a divorce." "Rather late in the day, isn't it?" "Yes," said Soames, and there was a silence. "I don't know much about these things, at least I've forgotten," said Jolyon with a wry smile. He himself had had to wait for death to grant him a divorce from the first Mrs. Jolyon. "Do you wish me to see her about it?" Soames raised his eyes to his cousin's face. "I suppose there's someone," he said. A shrug moved Jolyon's shoulders. "I don't know at all. I imagine you may have both lived as if the other were dead. It's usual in these cases." Soames turned to the window. A few early fallen oak leaves strewed the terrace already, and were rolling round in the wind. Jolyon saw the figures of Holly and Val Dartie moving across the lawn towards the stables. "I'm not going to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds," he thought. "I must act for her. The Dad would have wished that." And for a swift moment he seemed to see his father's figure in the old armchair, just beyond Soames, sitting with knees crossed, the Times in his hand. It vanished. "My father was fond of her," he said quietly. "Why he should have been, I don't know," Soames answered without looking round. "She brought trouble to your daughter June. She brought trouble to everyone. I gave her all she wanted. I would have given her even forgiveness, but she chose to leave me." In Jolyon, compassion was checked by the tone of that close voice. What was there in the fellow that made it so difficult to be sorry for him? "I can go and see her if you like," he said. "I suppose she might be glad of a divorce, but I know nothing." Soames nodded. "Yes, please go. As I say, I know her address, but I've no wish to see her." His tongue was busy with his lips as if they were very dry. "You'll have some tea," said Jolyon, stifling the words, "and see the house." And he led the way into the hall. When he had rung the bell and ordered tea, he went to his easel to turn his drawing to the wall. He could not bear somehow that his work should be seen by Soames, who was standing there in the middle of the great room, which had been designed expressly to afford wall space for his own pictures. In his cousin's face, with its unseizable family likeness to himself, in its chinny, narrow, concentrated look, Jolyon saw that which moved him to the thought, "That chap could never forget anything, nor ever give himself away. He's pathetic." End of Part 1, Chapter 6. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
Part 1, Chapter 7 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 7. The Colt and the Filly. When young Val left the presence of the last generation, he was thinking, "This is jolly dull. Uncle Soames does take the bun. I wonder what this filly's like." He anticipated no pleasure from her society, and suddenly he saw her standing there looking at him. Why, she was pretty! What luck! "I'm afraid you don't know me," he said. "My name is Val Dartie. I am once removed, second cousin, something like that, you know. My mother's name was Forsyte." Holly, whose slim brown hand remained in his because she was too shy to withdraw it, said: "I don't know any of my relations. Are there many?" "Tons. They are awful, most of them. At least, I don't know some of them. One's relations always are, aren't they?" "I expect they think one awful too," said Holly. "I don't know why they should. No one could think you awful, of course." Holly looked at him. The wistful candour in those grey eyes gave young Val a sudden feeling that he must protect her. "I mean there are people and people," he added astutely. "Your dad looks awfully decent, for instance." "Oh yes," said Holly fervently, "he is." A flush mounted in Val's cheeks. That scene in the Pandemonium promenade, the dark man with the pink carnation developing into his own father. "But you know what the Forsytes are," he said almost viciously. "Oh, I forgot, you don't." "What are they?" "Oh, fearfully careful. Not sportsmen a bit. Look at Uncle Soames." "I would like to," said Holly. Val resisted a desire to run his arms through hers. "Oh no," he said, "let's go out. You'll see him quite soon enough." "What is your brother like?" Holly led the way on to the terrace and down to the lawn without answering. How describe Jolly, who ever since she remembered anything had been her lord, master, and ideal? "Does he sit on you?" said Val shrewdly. "I shall be knowing him at Oxford. Have you got any horses?" Holly nodded. "Would you like to see the stables?" "Rather." They passed under the oak tree, through a thin shrubbery, into the stable yard. There, under a clock tower, lay a fluffy brown and white dog, so old that he did not get up, but faintly waved the tail curled over his back. "That is Balthasar," said Holly. "He is so old, awfully old. Nearly as old as I am. Poor old boy. He's devoted to Dad." "Balthasar? That's a rum name." "He isn't pure bred, you know." "No, but he's a darling," and she bent down to stroke the dog. Gentle and supple, with dark-covered head and slim brown neck and hands, she seemed to Val strange and sweet, like a thing slipped between him and all previous knowledge. "When Grandfather died," she said, "he would not eat for 2 days. He saw him die, you know." "Was that old Uncle Jolyon? Mother always said he was a topper." "He was," said Holly simply, and opened the stable door. In a loose box stood a silver roan of about 15 hands, with a long black tail and mane. "This is mine, Fairy." "Oh," said Val, "she's a jolly palfrey. But you ought to bang her tail. She'd look much smarter." Then, catching her wondering look, he thought suddenly: "I don't know anything she likes." And he took a long sniff of the stable air. "Horses are ripping, aren't they? My dad—" He stopped. "Yes?" said Holly. An impulse to unbosom himself almost overcame him, but not quite. "Oh! I don't know. He has often gone a mucker over them. I'm jolly keen on them too, riding and hunting. I like racing awfully as well. I should like to be a gentleman rider." And oblivious of the fact that he had but one more day in town, With 2 engagements, he plumped out, "I say, if I hire a gee tomorrow, will you come a ride in Richmond Park?" Holly clasped her hands. "Oh yes, I simply love riding. But there is Jolly's horse. Why don't you ride him? Here he is. We could go after tea." Val looked doubtfully at his trousered legs. He had imagined them immaculate before her eyes in high brown boots and Bedford cords. "I don't much like riding his horse," he said. "He might not like it. Besides, Uncle Soames wants to get back, I expect. Not that I believe in buckling under to him, you know. You haven't got an uncle, have you? This is rather a good beast," he added, scrutinizing Jolly's horse, a dark brown, which was showing the whites of its eyes. "You haven't got any hunting here, I suppose?" "No, I don't know that I want to hunt. It must be awfully exciting, of course, but it is cruel, isn't it? June says so." "Cruel?" ejaculated Val. "Oh, that's all rot. Who is June?" "My sister. My half-sister, you know, much older than me." She had put her hands up to both cheeks of Jolly's horse, and was rubbing her nose against its nose with a gentle snuffling noise, which seemed to have a hypnotic effect on the animal. Val contemplated her cheek resting against the horse's nose, and her eyes gleaming round at him. "She's really a duck," he thought. They returned to the house less talkative, followed this time by the dog Balthasar, walking more slowly than anything on earth, and clearly expecting them not to exceed his speed limit. "This is a ripping place," said Val from under the oak tree, where they had paused to allow the dog Balthasar to come up. "Yes," said Holly, and sighed. "Of course I want to go everywhere. I wish I were a gipsy." "Yes, gipsies are jolly," replied Val, with a conviction which had just come to him. "You're rather like one, you know." Holly's face shone suddenly and deeply, like dark leaves gilded by the sun. "To go mad rabbiting everywhere, and see everything, and live in the open, oh, wouldn't it be fun?" "Let's do it," said Val. "Oh yes, let's. It would be grand sport, just you and I." Then Holly perceived the quaintness and gushed. "Well, we've got to do it," said Val obstinately, but reddening too. "I believe in doing things you want to do. What's down there?" "The kitchen garden, and the pond, and the coppice, and the farm." "Let's go down." Holly glanced back at the house. "It is tea time, I expect. There is Dad beckoning." Val, uttering a growly sound, followed her towards the house. When they re-entered the hall gallery, the sight of 2 middle-aged Forsytes drinking tea together had its magical effect, and they became quite silent. It was indeed an impressive spectacle. The 2 were seated side by side on an arrangement in marquetry, which looked like 3 silvery pink chairs made one, with a low tea table in front of them. They seemed to have taken up that position as far apart as the seat would permit, so that they need not look at each other too much. And they were eating and drinking rather than talking. Soames, with his air of despising the tea cake as it disappeared, Jolyon of finding himself slightly amusing. To the casual eye, neither would have seemed greedy. But both were getting through a good deal of sustenance. The 2 young ones having been supplied with food, the process went on silent and absorbative, till with the advent of cigarettes Jolyon said to Soames: And how's Uncle James? Thanks. Very shaky. We are a wonderful family, aren't we? The other day I was calculating the average age of the 10 old Forsytes from my father's family Bible. I make it 84 already, and 5 still living. They ought to beat the record. And looking whimsically at Soames, he added, "We aren't the men they were, you know." Soames smiled. "Do you really think I shall admit that I am not their equal," he seemed to be saying, "or that I have got to give up anything, especially life?" "We may live to their age, perhaps," pursued Jolyon, "but self-consciousness is a handicap, you know, and that is the difference between us. We have lost conviction. How and when self-consciousness was born, I never can make out. My father had a little, but I don't believe any other of the old Forsytes ever had a scrap. Never to see yourself as others see you, it is a wonderful preservative. The whole history of the last century is in the difference between us. And between us and you," he added, gazing through a ring of smoke at Val and Holly, uncomfortable under his quizzical regard, "there will be another difference. I wonder what." Soames took out his watch. "We must go," he said, "if we are to catch our train." "Uncle Soames never misses a train," muttered Val, with his mouth full. "Why should I?" Soames answered simply. "Oh, I don't know," grumbled Val. "Other people do." At the front door he gave Holly's slim brown hand a long and surreptitious squeeze. "Look out for me tomorrow," he whispered. "3 o'clock. I will wait for you in the road. It will save time. We'll have a ripping ride." He gazed back at her from the lodge gate, and, but for the principles of a man about town, would have waved his hand. He felt in no mood to tolerate his uncle's conversation. But he was not in danger. Soames preserved a perfect muteness, busy with faraway thoughts. The yellow leaves came down about those two walking the mile and a half which Soames had traversed so often in those long ago days when he came down to watch with secret pride the building of the house, that house which was to have been the home of him and her, from whom he was now going to seek release. He looked back once, up that endless vista of autumn lane between the yellowing hedges. What an age ago! "I don't want to see her," he had said to Jolyon. Was that true? "I may have to," he thought, and he shivered, seized by one of those queer shudderings that they say mean footsteps on one's grave. A chilly world, a queer world. And glancing sidelong at his nephew, he thought, "Wish I were his age. I wonder what she's like now." End of Part 1, Chapter 7. The Colt and the Filly.
Part 1, Chapter 8 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 8. Jolyon prosecutes trusteeship. When those two were gone, Jolyon did not return to his painting, for daylight was failing, but went to the study, craving unconsciously a revival of that momentary vision of his father sitting in the old leather chair, with his knees crossed and his straight eyes gazing up from under the dome of his massive brow. Often in this little room, cosiest in the house, Jolyon would catch a moment of communion with his father. Not, indeed, that he had definitely any faith in the persistence of the human spirit; the feeling was not so logical. It was rather an atmospheric impact, like a scent, or one of those strong animistic impressions from forms or effects of light to which those with the artist's eye are especially prone. Here only, in this little unchanged room where his father had spent the most of his waking hours, could be retrieved the feeling that he was not quite gone, that the steady counsel of that old spirit and the warmth of his masterful lovability endured. What would his father be advising now, in this sudden recrudescence of an old tragedy? What would he say to this menace against her to whom he had taken such a fancy in the last weeks of his life? "I must do my best for her," thought Jolyon. "He left her to me in his will. But what is the best?" And as if seeking to regain the sapience, the balance and shrewd common sense of that old Forsyte, he sat down in the ancient chair and crossed his knees. But he felt a mere shadow sitting there, nor did any inspiration come, while the fingers of the wind tapped on the darkening panes of the French window. Go and see her, he thought, or ask her to come down here? What's her life been? What is it now, I wonder? Beastly to rake up things at this time of day. Again the figure of his cousin standing with a hand on a front door of a fine olive green leaped out, vivid like one of those figures from old-fashioned clocks when the hour strikes, and his words sounded in Jolyon's ears clearer than any chime. "I manage my own affairs. I've told you once, I'll tell you again. We are not at home." The repugnance he had then felt for Soames, for his flat-cheeked, shaven face full of spiritual bull-doggedness, for his spare, square, sleek figure slightly crouched as it were over the bone he could not digest, came now again, fresh as ever, nay, with an odd increase. "I dislike him," he thought. "I dislike him to the very roots of me. And that's lucky. It'll make it easier for me to back his wife." Half artist and half Forsyte, Jolyon was constitutionally averse from what he termed ructions. Unless angered, he conformed deeply to that classic description of the she-dog: "'E'd rather run than fight." A little smile became settled in his beard. Ironical that Soames should come down here, to this house built for himself. How he had gazed and gaped at this ruin of his past intention, furtively nosing at the walls and stairway, appraising everything. And intuitively Jolyon thought, "I believe the fellow even now would like to be living here. He could never leave off longing for what he once owned. Well, I must act somehow or other. But it's a bore, a great bore." Late that evening he wrote to the Chelsea flat, asking if Irene would see him. The old century which had seen the plant of individualism flower so wonderfully was setting in a sky orange with coming storms. Rumours of war added to the briskness of a London turbulent at the close of the summer holidays. And the streets to Jolyon, who was not often up in town, had a feverish look, due to these new motor cars and cabs of which he disapproved aesthetically. He counted these vehicles from his hansom, and made the proportion of them 1 in 20. They were 1 in 30 about a year ago, he thought. They've come to stay, just so much more rattling round of wheels and general stink. For he was one of those rather rare Liberals who object to anything new when it takes a material form. He instructed his driver to get down to the river quickly, out of the traffic, desiring to look at the water through the mellowing screen of plane trees. At the little block of flats which stood back some 50 yards from the embankment, he told the cabman to wait and went up to the first floor. Yes, Mrs. Heron was at home. The effect of a settled if very modest income was at once apparent to him, remembering the threadbare refinement in that tiny flat 8 years ago when he announced her good fortune. Everything was now fresh, dainty, and smelled of flowers. The general effect was silvery with touches of black, hydrangea colour, and gold. A woman of great taste, he thought. Time had dealt gently with Jolyon, for he was a Forsyte. But with Irene time hardly seemed to deal at all, or such was his impression. She appeared to him not a day older, standing there in mole-coloured velvet corduroy, with soft, dark eyes and dark gold hair, with outstretched hands and a little smile. "Won't you sit down?" He had probably never occupied a chair with a fuller sense of embarrassment. "You look absolutely unchanged," he said. "And you look younger, Cousin Jolyon." Jolyon ran his hands through his hair, whose thickness was still a comfort to him. "I'm ancient, but I don't feel it. That's one thing about painting, it keeps you young. Titian lived to 99 and had to have plague to kill him off. Do you know, the first time I ever saw you I thought of a picture by him?" "When did you see me for the first time?" "In the Botanical Gardens." "How did you know me if you'd never seen me before?" "By someone who came up to you." He was looking at her heartily, but her face did not change, and she said quietly: "Yes, many lives ago." "What is your recipe for youth, Irene?" "People who don't live are wonderfully preserved." A bitter little saying. People who don't live. But an opening, and he took it. "You remember my cousin Soames?" He saw her smile faintly at that whimsicality, and at once went on: "He came to see me the day before yesterday. He wants a divorce. Do you?" "I?" The word seemed startled out of her. "After 12 years? It's rather late. Won't it be difficult?" Jolyon looked hard into her face. "Unless," he said. "Unless I have a lover now. But I have never had one since." What did he feel at the simplicity and candour of those words? Relief, surprise, pity. Venus for 12 years without a lover. "And yet," he said, "I suppose you would give a good deal to be free too?" "I don't know. What does it matter now?" "But if you were to love again?" "I should love." In that simple answer she seemed to sum up the whole philosophy of one on whom the world had turned its back. "Well, is there anything you would like me to say to him?" "Only that I'm sorry he's not free. He had his chance once. I don't know why he didn't take it." "Because he was a Forsyte. We never part with things, you know, unless we want something in their place, and not always then." Irene smiled. "Don't you, Cousin Jolyon? I think you do." "Of course I'm a bit of a mongrel, not quite a pure Forsyte. I never take the halfpennies off my cheques, I put them on," said Jolyon uneasily. "Well, what does Soames want in place of me now?" "I don't know. Perhaps children." She was silent for a little, looking down. "Yes," she murmured, "it's hard. I would help him to be free if I could." Jolyon gazed into his hat. His embarrassment was increasing fast. So was his admiration, his wonder, and his pity. She was so lovely and so lonely, and altogether it was such a coil. "Well," he said, "I shall have to see Soames. If there's anything I can do for you, I'm always at your service. You must think of me as a wretched substitute for my father. At all events, I'll let you know what happens when I speak to Soames. He may supply the material himself." She shook her head. "You see, he has a lot to lose, and I have nothing. I should like him to be free, but I don't see what I can do." "Nor I at the moment," said Jolyon, and soon after took his leave. He went down to his hansom. 3:30. Soames would be at his office still. "To the Poultry," he called through the trap. In front of the Houses of Parliament and in Whitehall newsvendors were calling: "Grave situation in the Transvaal." But the cries hardly roused him, absorbed in recollection of that very beautiful figure, of her soft dark glance, and the words: "I have never had one since." What on earth did such a woman do with her life, backwatered like this? Solitary, unprotected, with every man's hand against her, or rather, reaching out to grasp her at the least sign. And year after year she went on like that. The word poultry above the passing citizens brought him back to reality. Forsyte, Bustard, and Forsyte, in black letters on a ground the colour of pea soup, spurred him to a sort of vigour, and he went up the stone stairs muttering: "Fusty musty ownerships! Well, we couldn't do without them." "I want Mr. Soames Forsyte," he said to the boy who opened the door. "What name?" "Mr. Jolyon Forsyte." The youth looked at him curiously, never having seen a Forsyte with a beard, and vanished. The offices of Forsyte, Bustard, and Forsyte had slowly absorbed the offices of Tooting and Bowles, and occupied the whole of the first floor. The firm consisted now of nothing but Soames and a number of managing and articled clerks. The complete retirement of James some 6 years ago had accelerated business, to which the final touch of speed had been imparted when Bustard dropped off worn out, as many believed, by the suit of Fryer versus Forsyte, more in Chancery than ever and less likely to benefit its beneficiaries. Soames, with his saner grasp of actualities, had never permitted it to worry him. On the contrary, he had long perceived that Providence had presented him therein with £200 a year net in perpetuity, and why not? When Jolyon entered, his cousin was drawing out a list of holdings in consols, which, in view of the rumours of war, he was going to advise his companies to put on the market at once before other companies did the same. He looked round, sidelong, and said, "How are you? Just 1 minute. Sit down, won't you?" And having entered 3 amounts and set a ruler to keep his place, he turned towards Jolyon, biting the side of his flat forefinger. "Yes?" he said. "I have seen her." Soames frowned. "Well?" "She has remained faithful to memory." Having said that, Jolyon was ashamed. His cousin had flushed a dusky yellowish red. What had made him tease the poor brute? "I was to tell you she is sorry you are not free. 12 years is a long time. You know your law and what chance it gives you." Soames uttered a curious little grunt, and the two remained a full minute without speaking. Like wax, thought Jolyon, watching that close face, where the flush was fast subsiding. He'll never give me a sign of what he's thinking or going to do. Like wax. And he transferred his gaze to a plan of that flourishing town, by street on sea, the future existence of which lay exposed on the wall to the possessive instincts of the firm's clients. The whimsical thought flashed through him: "I wonder if I shall get a bill of costs for this? To attending Mr. Jolyon Forsyte in the matter of my divorce, to receiving his account of his visit to my wife, and to advising him to go and see her again, 16 and 8 pence." Suddenly Soames said, "I can't go on like this. I tell you I can't go on like this." His eyes were shifting from side to side like an animal's when it looks for ways of escape. "He really suffers," thought Jolyon. "I've no business to forget that just because I don't like him." "Surely," he said gently, "it lies with yourself. A man can always put these things through if he'll take it on himself." Soames turned square to him with a sound which seemed to come from somewhere very deep. "Why should I suffer more than I've suffered already? Why should I?" Jolyon could only shrug his shoulders. His reason agreed, his instinct rebelled; he could not have said why. "Your father," went on Soames, "took an interest in her. Why, goodness knows. And I suppose you do too?" He gave Jolyon a sharp look. "It seems to me that one only has to do another person a wrong to get all the sympathy. I don't know in what way I was to blame. I've never known. I always treated her well. I gave her everything she could wish for. I wanted her." Again Jolyon's reason nodded. Again his instinct shook its head. "What is it?" he thought. "There must be something wrong in me. Yet if there is, I'd rather be wrong than right." "After all," said Soames with a sort of glum fierceness, "she was my wife." In a flash the thought went through his listener. There it is. Ownerships. Well, we all own things. But human beings? Pah! "You have to look at facts," he said dryly, "or rather the want of them." Soames gave him another quick suspicious look. "The want of them?" he said. "Yes, but I am not so sure." "I beg your pardon," replied Jolyon. "I've told you what she said. It was explicit." "My experience has not been one to promote blind confidence in her word. We shall see." Jolyon got up. "Good-bye," he said curtly. "Good-bye," returned Soames, and Jolyon went out trying to understand the look, half startled, half menacing, on his cousin's face. He sought Waterloo Station in a disturbed frame of mind, as though the skin of his moral being had been scraped, and all the way down in the train he thought of Irene in her lonely flat, and of Soames in his lonely office, and of the strange paralysis of life that lay on them both. In Chancery, he thought. Both their necks in Chancery, and hers so pretty. End of Part 1, Chapter 8. Recording by Leanne Howlett.